And Fred Moorfield is the Director of Spectrum Policy and Programs at the Office of the Department of Defense, Chief Information Officer, coming off a record spectrum auction that benefited the U.S. Treasury and also the DoD. We're very happy to have Fred at TIA 2015 to respond to this historical development. And Fred, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. I mentioned in the introduction that we're coming off a historical event, the AWS 3 auction that, as you very well know, raised over $40 billion. The U.S. Treasury benefited from that, and in turn, the Department of Defense benefited as well. Has there, since that auction, been a cultural shift at military institutions, military government agencies, when they see this real money coming in?
Actually not. From a DoD's perspective, our first perspective is about the mission. So we had already been in the midst of a culture shift. We put in place things like the DoD Spectrum Strategy, ultimately the Roadmap and Action Plan. We also put in place the National Spectrum Consortium, as well as the National Advanced Spectrum Communication Test Network. We put in these foundational things, which we see as the next step toward facilitating more spectrum sharing and working closely together with industry to solve some of these tough spectrum sharing problems.
Now, we're always, as an industry, looking for a better relationship between the public and private sector, in this case, the Department of Defense and industry. How has the recently released 3.5 gigahertz order made that happen?
Yeah, so that's just another example of DoD working closely with industry to solve some of these tough spectrum sharing problems. In this particular case, the 3.5 gigahertz band was a tough one to solve. DoD operates high-powered military systems in the band. DoD sitting across the table with industry to work toward solving some of that tough problem. Helping to shape industry's technology, where they came up with a sensing capability as well as a database capability, which we think will go a long way to helping facilitate sharing in the band.
Now, of course, $41 billion for the U.S. Treasury sounds like a whole lot of money, but there are some restrictions to these, I guess, pockets of money, if you will, as they are connected to particular spectrum bands. How does that work?
Yeah, so the current legislation, the current law, is pretty rigid. It connects any spectrum auctions to specific bands that were auctioned. I think there's some opportunities there that we've been talking with FCC and the NTIA, as well as OMB, about ways that we can help either relax the legislation or interpret the legislation in a way that would facilitate some flexible use of the band. As an example, that would allow the band to be able to be used to study other bands other than the ones that were just auctioned, to do some technology development, and also to do some spectrum sharing studies to also identify other bands that would allow spectrum access for industry as well as the federal government access to non-federal spectrum.
I'm glad you mentioned spectrum sharing technologies. Typically, government will go to these kind of large name brand companies to discover new innovations, and in particular for spectrum sharing. TIA has smaller companies on their membership, and those smaller companies are actually here at the conference. Are these smaller guys, these smaller players, able to show their technologies now?
Absolutely, and that's a good question. Under the auspices of the National Spectrum Consortium, where we're established the environment where we can now work directly with industry to help together work to develop some of these spectrum sharing technologies together, is the forum that we believe is a good place for the small business companies to participate, because we really are looking to some of these smaller companies for some of these new ideas, and we know that the smaller companies, we have access to it, a lot of the bigger companies all the time. But we think this is an opportunity for some of the smaller companies to play in this arena, whether it's individually or as part of the team. But we need them to play in that Spectrum Consortium, because that's going to be the forum where DoD and industry is going to work together to develop these technology solutions to try to help solve this tough spectrum sharing problem going forward.
Well, Fred, I'm sure you would agree that it was interesting to see how the AWS 3 spectrum auction played out. And of course, there's another spectrum auction next year in 2016. So we'll see how that shakes out as well. It's certainly good to have somebody like you on our stage to kind of explain all the minutia to us. And hopefully in the future, we'll do that again.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it.
Fred, it's nice meeting you. Thank you. Thanks for your time. And for all of TIA Now's coverage of TIA 2015, network of the future, please log on to tinow.org. So long.